In ancient Rome, Emperor Nero hunts Christians. In prison, the Apostle John sees the apocalypse. In Jerusalem, Jews revolt in all-out war. For them, it's the end of the world. One Christian woman holds the key to a war of angels and demons that will change the future forever. Chronicles of the Apocalypse is a series of biblical novels by best-selling author Brian Godawa, telling the story of the book of Revelation in the 1st century. 4 supernatural novels. Read them all, from Tyrant, Rise of the Beast, to Judgment, Wrath of the Lamb. Available in ebook, paperback, and audiobook at Amazon.com. That's Chronicles of the Apocalypse by Brian Godawa at Amazon.com.
All right, man. Good to have you back. Brian Godawa on Through the Black, Part 5. Continuing through Revelation. Love it or hate it, we're still doing it. It's not going anywhere, and we're gonna keep making one after the other until we get through with Revelation. So, welcome back, and yeah, I think we're going through chapter 8 today. Is that right, Brian?
Yeah, we're gonna go through chapter 8. Try to get to 8 and 9, but we'll see. We're gonna hit the trumpets, basically.
Tell people where your website is real quick if they want to find you while they're listening.
Yeah, write this down now, folks. It's Godawa.com, Godawa.com. On there, I've got a very interesting website full of all kind of stuff and material that we're talking about today, as well as my novels and all that kind of stuff. So good theology and fascinating art and stuff, because I'm an artist. So it'll be very, very interesting. You can get all my books at Amazon. We'll make reference to those as we talk, because I wrote a novel series called Chronicles of the Apocalypse. And the one thing I wanted to, say up front every time here is I had the privilege of being able to have access to Ken Gentry's upcoming commentary on Revelation called The Divorce of Israel. It's not out yet. Should be out within the year. But it's been too long. It's been too long. They've been working on trying to get it out. But anyway, sign up to my website, and I'll let you know as soon as it's out. And I may even do a couple raffles of offering some of the books away. But basically, he's the scholar that I've relied on heavily for my preterist understanding to write my novels. And so my novels, Chronicles of the Apocalypse, are basically sort of like a preterist left behind, for lack of a better phrase, but which is a terrible thing to say, because I didn't try to make it like Left Behind. It's just I actually did come to the point where I thought, I can write the theology, and I do, and Christians like that, but there's a lot of people who the eschatology can get so complicated and just too much. It's just too much for them, but they enjoy being entertained, and if they can get the theology through a story that plays out the theology and the eschatology in a very dramatic way, then that's much more, in fact, for me personally, I think that's more helpful. I prefer that way myself. So keep that in mind as we're talking about these things. I'll make reference to the novels and how I may have dealt with it.
So do you think that this thing that we're doing lately, that's kind of just developed as we've rolled with it, it seems to me like it is actually adding something to the post-millennial conversation that hasn't been out there, right? Just also largely because of Ken Gentry's work, that's kind of getting like people get a sneak peek of it before it's even out, right? I mean, am I wrong in saying that? I mean, it just seems
absolutely, absolutely, because I think the premise of post-millennialism is precisely the Daniel 2 notion, or actually just the book of Daniel notion, where the Daniel 2 talks about the dream of the statues and the 4 kingdoms, the 4 Gentile kingdoms, starting with Babylon and going to the Medes and Persians and Greece, and then ultimately Rome. He was foretelling the future of the times of the Gentiles, which, by the way, that's an interesting, unique interpretation that people refer to end times prophecy, and they quote that Bible verse about the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Maybe you can look that up while I'm talking, because I can't remember which one it is, but that's always been a difficult verse for everybody. But I think I think it's in Romans.
Are you talking about Romans 11?
Yeah, why don't you read that?
Okay, I got to pull it up real quick. Let me. I just went into my Bible. Give me a second.
I can get it actually. Romans 11. And, he's
I brought
talking
this
about
up. I brought this up last time, and you mentioned there being some different interpretations. Because I was going off of sort of my readings in the Puritans, which were really fascinated with that verse, and I'm actually interested in what else that could mean. So
yeah, so well, as a matter of fact, the sort of typical post-millennial view, including Gentry, believes that even though most of the last days prophecy, all the last days prophecies have been fulfilled, there is no future Antichrist or rapture or anything like that. While that's the case, that there is still a future situation for what we know as earthly Israel, and that Romans 11:25 is a reference to that. And it says, lest you be wise in your own sight, I do not want you to be unaware of the mystery that a partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. I'm so sorry. I'm taking the wrong Bible verse. That's a whole nother issue. I'm talking about the times of the Gentiles.
Okay, that was my fault then.
Time.
I've had that verse. I've been obsessed with that verse lately as I've been reading Ian Murray's book, The Puritan Hope.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I think that there's also a preterist understanding of that does tie that to it's the first century gospel and all that. But we can talk about that another time. Here's what I wanted to talk about. Luke 21. Sorry, everybody. That's where Jesus is saying, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, all right, this is the same Olivet discourse he was in Matthew 24. Know that its desolation has come near. We talked about how in Matthew he says, when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it ought not, know that its destruction is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. And Luke is actually sort of writing to Gentiles, so he's explaining. How should we say? He's translating the concept of abomination of desolation. What does that mean? Jews would have a better understanding of it from Daniel, but Gentiles wouldn't. So he just spells it out and says, well, the abomination of desolation is Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, and it brings desolation, abomination of desolation, right? So that's the context there, and that's where we see why, Matthew 24 is fulfilled in the first century, not in some future. Talks about fleeing to the mountains, and he says, these are the days of vengeance to fulfill all that is written. And, if you're pregnant, woe to you, great distress upon the earth, and wrath against this people. This people is Israel, earthly Israel. So there's this concept of wrath that we're going to be addressing a lot throughout Revelation, and even today. Wrath, the wrath that is to come. A lot of people read the word wrath, and they just... because of our biases, we automatically just sort of think of, that must be the last judgment. You're going to be you're going to be dead. When you're dead, you're judged. But the wrath to come was a very specific phrase that I would argue is a reference to the destruction of Jerusalem. So when you see this references to wrath throughout the New Testament, that's what it's usually referring to, not to the end of time judgment or, being thrown into hell or whatever, something like that. So he's saying there's wrath against this people. Okay, that was the Jerusalem destruction. And then it says they will fall by the edge of the sword, be led captive among all nations, right? And okay, yeah, and that's what happened in AD 70. Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles. And we're going to see how that is referenced in Revelation. That same concept of trampling underfoot by the Gentiles will come up in chapter 11. And it's connecting Revelation to Luke 21, which is another evidence that Revelation happened in the first century. So, but here's the thing. He says, we'll be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Now, some people, sort of tend to take that to mean, well, the gospel brings in the Gentiles. And so the times of the Gentiles is the gospel allowing Gentiles to become one with Jews in belief in Messiah, right? And that's kind of what how they've tended to interpret it. But I don't think that's what it actually means. I think it's actually, Jesus drew a lot from Daniel. I think he's drawing from Daniel. And I think what he's saying is the times of the Gentiles is the concept that they have their time. In other words, they're ruling the world, not little old Israel. Not only that, but the whole essence of prophecy in Daniel in particular is that all these kingdoms will basically be in power and in control over Israel. First Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, then the Medo-Persians, then the Macedonian Greeks, then Rome. But then what does Daniel say in Daniel 2 when he has that vision and he sees those kingdoms represented in that statue, and then the little stone that hits the statue, right?
Yeah, what is it? Clay's mixed. I don't know, miry mix of clay or something.
Yeah, it hits it on the feet, and the feet represented Rome. And it says the stone that struck the image became a great mountain that filled the earth. And that's the kingdom of God. But here's what he says. In the days of those kings, in Daniel 2, verse 44, the God of heaven, in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. So it's this inauguration of the kingdom of God that's going to overcome all these kingdoms. But in the meantime, and he says, just as you saw that a stone was cut from a mountain by no human hand, and it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay. So this whole system is what was understood to be the times of the Gentiles, meaning it's the time of these Gentile kingdoms that would rule the world, and little old Israel would just be there. But ultimately, Messiah would come. He'd hit the feet of that statue, which historically speaking, that ended up being Rome, and they were sort of the culmination of all those kingdoms, right? And then ultimately he would bring his kingdom would start in the days of Rome, and it would grow to be the biggest kingdom. So this is the glorious, successful kingdom of God. Daniel says it will begin in the days of Rome, and it will grow to be and it will bring a crashing halt to that kingdom of Rome that it was under, and ultimately Rome did fall under the weight of the effect of Christianity, at least for one of the major reasons. But the point is that then from there, as Daniel said, it became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. So the kingdom of God is now growing to be that mountain, that will fill the earth. Just like Jesus said, it starts like a little seed, but it grows to become the biggest tree. It starts like a little leaven, but it leavens the whole lump of dough. It's all these parables that give the idea of it's a historical growth. It takes time, but it is that kingdom that was promised, that kingdom that would be overcome all kingdoms, right? And that's the sort of victorious notion of postmillennialism. And this is where you can start to see how preterism is intimately a part of that. Not necessarily. There are amillennialists who are preterists, so you don't have to be that. But you can certainly see how it ties in where, if all of prophecy, if all the messianic prophecy and all that was sort of looking forward to Christ coming and then bringing salvation and judgment in the first century, eliminating the old covenant, bringing in the new covenant, starting a new kingdom, and that would from that point grow to fill the earth. If that makes sense with preterist understanding is what I'm getting at, right?
It does make sense. Let me ask you this real quick, short rabbit trail, since we're both heavily involved in
Sure.
Nephilim stuff. A lot of people use Daniel 2:42 and 43 to talk about the future of the Nephilim. You've heard that argument before. They will commingle their seed with the seed of men in that passage, and they bring that up.
Oh, yes.
So
Where is that?
I know that I don't want to go too far down the rabbit trail, but I just know there are a lot of people that are going to listen to this and start screaming that this is actually future prophecy about the return of the Nephilim. And I just wanted to give you a moment to maybe just address that. So,
yeah, I don't think I can right now. I don't think
don't worry about it. We'll come back to it, because one thing we really didn't talk about, we've got to do a special show on this one day, is sort of the Nephilim in relationship to modern futurist prophecy. Maybe that would just be a better overarching topic for another show. So
yeah, that would be a little bit going off topic right now. And I have heard that view, and I have heard the answer to it, but I don't have it at my fingertips right now.
That's fine. So, if you don't have it on the tip of your head, let's just move into Revelation.
So there's that, and then let's do another recap of kind of some of the important points, because they all come into play here. Remember that the main argument. So the times of the Gentiles is fulfilled when Messiah comes. He ends the rule of the Gentiles, and the kingdom of God is now free from the people of God. The kingdom of God has its own establishment in this world through Messiah, and it's now growing to fill the earth and take over all those kingdoms. And that's what Jesus was referring to when he says, until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Because when Messiah comes and sets up his kingdom, as he did in the first century, as we've already seen, then, and we're going to see more of that, by the way, in the upcoming chapters here. But anywho, so,
It is
but
interesting.
okay.
Like the deeper down the rabbit trail of preterism I go, the more a lot of these things that have typically been confusing. You know, you see the premillennial dispensationalist timelines, and everybody, like the critiques that we've gotten have been, God's not the author of confusion, stop looking at man's books, you know, the stuff I brought up last time. But when you look at the timelines of sort of the modern day prophecy charts, they're the most confusing things you could ever see. Try to decipher one of those today. They spread out 8 feet across the wall. There are arrows moving everywhere. Everything's different colors. And like at the end of the day, just trying to think, when I look at Daniel 2 through the lens of preterists, I'm like, that's so much more simple. That's so much more simple.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, we don't have the big charts. You know, we could make a little bit of a chart, but it would all be basically what happened in the first century, you know. So maybe we need that, because a graphic is certainly helpful, and people love graphics. So maybe I'll work on one of those soon, you know. But to remind us of what's the purpose of the book of Revelation, we're operating from, you know, Revelation 1 verse 7, behold, he is coming on the cloud with the clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him, and all the tribes of the land will wail on account of him. And the idea there is that this is a reference to Matthew 24, where Jesus is saying, because the earthly Israel rejected Messiah, Jesus is coming in the clouds in judgment to judge her, destroy her temple and her holy city, and judge them and vindicate his martyrs, which are the Christians who are persecuted by those Jews and the Romans as well. But particularly God is focused on the Jews, his people. That's who he wants to deal with more than the Gentile nations. But nevertheless, that's the sort of context of what this whole book is about. And let's see, was so the vindication, the judgment, and also the establishment of his kingdom, which would then grow to fill the earth, and we'll see that later on in later passages. I'm sorry. And the idea was that Revelation is talking about the end of the old covenant, God's divorce of apostate Israel. Apostate Israel had become a harlot. We'll see that eventually. Give you a preview. Apostate Israel, in particular, the religious leaders, are the harlot. And he's going to divorce her and marry a new bride, the bride of Christ, right? A new wife, the bride of Christ. And that's, of course, in Revelation 21, but we'll get to that eventually. So anyway, but that's sort of the storyline that we're going on here. So this wrath that we're talking about here is not wrath of, you know, the end of the world and judgment of all of mankind. It's using extreme poetic and hyperbolic language about very localized judgment on Jerusalem in particular. And it makes more sense, as we've already seen a lot of, you look through and we're going to do more of this, when you see weird imagery in Revelation, ask yourself, is there precedent in the Old Testament? And go there and learn from it, because John is drawing from multiple prophetic writings. He's steeped in Old Testament. He draws from Daniel. He draws heavily from Ezekiel. We've mentioned this before, that some scholars have shown that the outline of Revelation follows very closely to if not perfectly, but closely to Ezekiel. And guess what? Ezekiel's prophecy was about the destruction of the first temple and Israel going into exile. So it would make sense that he would draw from common imagery for a common event with a common meaning. Only this time, it's the permanent divorce, whereas in the past, they were going to come back from exile. But because coming back from exile meant coming into Christ, then if you reject Christ, there is no more coming back. And so that's the book of Hebrews, by the way. But nevertheless, so Revelation is telling that story, and we already addressed a couple of key issues about words that can make the whole thing mean something different, and how easily we are because of our modern bias, our modern bias, but also just language and translation can be problematic. A couple words that we were noticing that if you understand them more in the Greek context, they don't mean what we think they mean, and that was earth. So when we're going to be reading passages where it says all the earth, we always think of the globe, because that's what we think in our modern minds, right? The earth. And no, the Greek doesn't mean that at all. It could mean a lot of land, but it means land. not only that, but more importantly, when God's talking to Israelites, he uses the word the land as a reference to the land of Israel, because that was what? The land of promise. And that was the whole universe to them, right? So this notion of the earth is actually the land. And all of a sudden, you now start to see the localized judgment of what we're talking about, you know? Excuse me. And there are other words like that. I mentioned wrath already. You know, when we hear the word wrath, we think, oh, that's end times judgment, the end of the world judgment. But no, wrath is just judgment for any sin. I mean, you know, people experience wrath of all kinds, but in particular, the word, the wrath, is a reference to this first century judgment. So I think I've kind of said all the few reminders that I wanted to. Maybe some of them will come to me as we go on here. But there was and in light of that, another key word that keeps coming up a lot is the inhabitants of the earth, which is actually the dwellers on the land in Greek, is better understood that way. We mentioned how you find that phrase in the Greek Old Testament multiple times, and it always refers to the people of Israel. So what we read as those who dwell on the earth about 20 times in Revelation, it actually is saying those who dwell on the land, which is the Israelites. Which makes you wonder, why is he calling them that? Well, I think part of the reason is he doesn't want to call them Israelites because they're no longer really true Israel. You know what I mean? And so he's referring to them obliquely because in a way they are turning and becoming something. They are becoming the enemies of God to be judged. So he doesn't want to call them that same old phrase, right? So with that, we talked last week about the 144,000, you're right, and before that was the seals. And now we're going to take a brief look at the seventh seal and then the trumpets to see that another thing that we mentioned before was there are multiple views of Revelation, and one of the strongest views is that it's a recapitulation, which means it's cyclical. So the prophecy often describes the same events, but from a different perspective, and thus you have the repetition of the seven seals, seven trumpets, seven bowls, and they're just sort of going back and describing that destruction, that single destruction of Israel and of the land of Israel and Jerusalem and the temple, with different aspects, elements, and showing an intensification as the time did go on with that event. The intensification grew until ultimate destruction. So it's a very stylistic approach as well. And so now we're moving into we talked about the first seven seals, and now we're up to the first six seals. Now we're up to the seventh seal. In chapter 8, verse 1, Revelation, he says, when the Lamb opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about a half an hour. And it's like that's the shortest time period in all of the book of Revelation. And, the impression here is that, okay, there's some kind of a pause in all this destruction, right? And what could that be? I don't know. But the idea there is that it could actually be a reference to the fact that there's a pause because now we're going to replay it from the beginning again, all right? I don't know. But nevertheless, we're trying to stick to the interesting things that people have specific interpretations about that matter. Then I saw the seven angels who stand before God, and the seven trumpets were given to them. And another angel stood at the altar with a golden censer, and he was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar of the throne. And the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints rose before God from the hand of the angel. And this is another dominant theme throughout the book of Revelation, is God's loving concern for his chosen people, his saints, and particularly his martyrs. But the martyrs also, those are the ones who die for their faith. Those are the ones who stand in for the saints of God. And so we have a remembrance here of saying, by the way, in the midst of all this suffering, because the saints will be doing some suffering, but their prayers are like incense, and God does not forget them. That's the point. He's reminding us of that, right? But so he takes that censer, though, that very censer of the prayers of the saints, right? And he fills it with fire from the altar and threw it on the land. It says the earth, but it's the land of Israel. And there were peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. And then we're going to go into the seven trumpets. And I think what I wanted to bring up there was just that this idea of fire. Fire is a commonly used reference symbol to judgment, and so that's there's nothing fancy about that. But this idea of taking the altar, throwing it to the land, and then having the peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightnings, and an earthquake. Now, I find that particular language interesting because another one of the major motifs throughout the entire book of Revelation is the Exodus motif. John is drawing, or God's visions are drawing from Exodus and this notion of Moses, bringing his first covenant, the Mosaic covenant, that God is now going to make obsolete and replace with a new covenant, right? So he's going to use similar language to show the similarities of the value and significance of this new covenant. So he uses these references to Exodus. And another one of the elements of Exodus that we've already talked about and we're going to see more of is the idea that the Exodus was God pulling out his chosen people out of Egypt in order to bring judgment upon Egypt and to rescue his people. So God always engages in both judgment and salvation at the same time. And in this case, in the book of Revelation, it's an exodus of his true people, which are believers in Messiah, out of the body of Old Testament Israel, who had rejected Messiah and had become Egypt. Literally, in chapter 11, Revelation chapter 11, he's referring to the city of Jerusalem in verse 8, and we'll talk about this more as well, I think, as time goes on, but it says, it's talking about the two witnesses, but that they die in the great city that symbolically is called Sodom and Egypt, where their Lord was crucified. So we know that Jerusalem was where the Lord was crucified, so he's referring to Jerusalem, and he's saying symbolically it's called Sodom and Egypt. Why? Because all throughout the Old Testament, there are examples where when God wants to judge someone, he likens them to Sodom, or he likens them to Babylon, or in this case, he likens them to Egypt. Why? Because Sodom was the biggest example of destruction that all the Jews usually referred to as, hey, if you're going to get judged, you're going to be like Sodom, right? Because it was so dramatic. And the other one is Babylon and Egypt, because Babylon was where they went into exile. Babylon becomes the ultimate enemy of God. So he uses Babylon as that symbolic reference to the ultimate enemy of God, which is why he's using that symbolism in Revelation as well, which we'll see later. In this verse, he's saying Jerusalem is symbolically called Egypt, because Egypt was the ultimate enemy of God before Babylon. Why? Because they were enslaved there for 400 years, right? But God is now saying Jerusalem has become Egypt. In other words, they have become the opposite of what they were supposed to be. They have now become the enemy of God, who's the ultimate enemy of God, who's going to be judged. So there's a lot of this transformation going on, that references to this transformation. And so coming back to Revelation 8 then, this is the reference to Exodus, all right? Now the Exodus is Israel, or Jerusalem, the unbelieving apostate Israel, has become Egypt. And God wants to now, as an Exodus, take his true believers out of Egypt. And his true believers are Christians, those who believe in Messiah, Jew and Gentile alike. But in particular, in Revelation, he's talking about Jerusalem because they're mostly Jews there. And so the Jewish believers in Messiah were going to be rescued and brought out in an Exodus. So that's that motif going on there. Well, here is another reference to Mount Sinai, which is kind of really fascinating. It's the same language that was used in the covenant origin at Sinai. And let me read just a little bit of that. Exodus 19:16 says, on the morning of the third day, there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast, so that all the people in the camp trembled. There's that trumpet blast too, another thing that's commonly referred to, that God uses as announcements of judgment or coming to war. And then in verse 18 and 19, Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord descended in fire like a smoke of a kiln, and all this kind of language. So what we're seeing here is the peals of thunder, rumblings, flashings of lightning, and earthquake. And I think earthquakes are, again, we've talked about this already, about how the earth trembling is a motif that describes the transformation of authority and power on the earth or in the heavens, but in particular, it's the change of covenants. In other words, it's like, this is earth shattering, right? So earthquakes are used as a symbol. Do they happen literally? Yeah, maybe both sometimes. I don't know, but mostly it's a reference in the prophetic text to the fact that there is something earth shattering that's going on here. But you've got the same language as the origin of the old covenant at Sinai, and now this is the origin of the new covenant happening. So he's drawing from that similar imagery. Then in verse 6, it says, now the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared to blow them. And, like I said, trumpets are often used for judgment or going to war. The first angel blew his trumpet, and there followed hail and fire mixed with blood, and these were thrown upon the earth. Upon the land. And a third of the land was burned up, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. So the first trumpet has this, these devastating catastrophes, right? And I think that they are the kinds of symbols where they're symbolic, but that doesn't mean they don't refer to actual historical realities, if that makes sense. So, for instance, Josephus writes in his Wars that the city was also set afire, not only the city itself, but all the villas and small cities that were round about it. And Galilee was filled with fire and blood. So there's a lot of language in Josephus about the fire mixed with blood and etc. And hail is one of the damaging, from heaven. Hail comes from heaven, and it was always understood as a sort of judgment from God or the gods, right? And so hail, fire mixed with blood, it's these expressions of destruction that are happening. And as a matter of fact, it's a way of describing what happened because of the Roman armies conquering the land and burning it up. Because it says a third of the earth was burned up. And we mentioned this earlier, that as we progress through Revelation, it goes from a fourth to a third to complete consummate destruction. Is this a literal exactness? I don't think so. I think it's just showing an increase of destruction. Like a third is like, wow, that's a lot. It's not half, it's not everything, but it's a lot of the land. And so you've got this progressive series of 3 judgments, and this is part of that. But it's kind of interesting because historically speaking, he also says a third of the trees were burned up and all the green grass was burned up. But it's interesting because Titus actually cut down when they would be
all the cypress trees, right?
Exactly, but not just around Jerusalem, around all the cities. Jotapata, he would clear cut the forest for miles, and in order to build siege engines in order to take the city. So they were really cutting down all the trees. And so you can see how that's a sense of, okay, even though all the trees are cut down, or in this case, it's burned up. And those who are hyperliteralists, demand, well, they have to be burned. They can't be cut down. And this is, we're not going to go over the old footage of just, look, this is prophetic hyperbole and images and impressionistic, an impressionistic drama that it's using to create a very historical destruction of Jerusalem, and it's clearly not literal. And so you have to understand prophetic imagery and how it symbolizes other things. So Josephus in Wars writes this. He goes, all the trees that were about the city of Jerusalem had been cut down for the making of the former banks. Banks were siege engines, or banks to get up the walls, right? Yet did the soldiers bring with them other materials from the distance of 10 miles. So like 10 miles of trees were cut down. It's pretty amazing.
Because if people don't understand, like one of the tactics was they would actually build a siege ramp up to the wall and spill over. Am I right about that?
Exactly.
You even see that, and that takes a lot of wood. Like Josephus records one of the biggest siege ramps ever built was after Jerusalem was destroyed. They went after Jewish survivors in Masada, I think. Is it Mashala? Masada. There we go. Thank you. And to bridge the gap, like they had to build a monster of a siege ramp. And by the time they got there, everybody had killed themselves. And there's a debate about that. But
yeah.
Big siege ramps.
Totally. Now, a lot of times they use dirt, but they would actually use dirt with logs, but also siege engines, which would be like catapults or towers that would roll up against the wall so that they could get in, And then here's Josephus still talking about Jerusalem, it had become desolate country in every way. Its trees were all cut down, nor could any foreigner that had formerly seen Judea, the most beautiful suburbs of the sea, now saw it as a desert. Lament and mourn sadly at so great a change, for the war had laid all the signs of beauty quite waste. So this is what I think it's referring to. No, it's not literally burning up, but they're definitely being, wasted, and it's referring to a very real sort of sense of the environment. Then verse 8, the second angel blew his trumpet, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea, and a third of the sea became blood. A third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. Again, this isn't a literal thing going on. It's actually talking about this mountain. So we talked about this before, but this is a more specific. This reference, I think, has some very specific references. As I'm trying to get this down, dang it, I don't know why it's not working.
See, that's the thing I think that throws most people off, including myself. Like I'm riveted to what you're saying right now, because these are areas I still have questions. Like I am not the spokesperson for the answers in these chapters. Yeah. And what I think throws people off, including myself, is the numerology. The numbers given seem so oddly specific. It's hard for like a modern mind to say, how can that be anything literal? Why doesn't it just say some fish? The fish in the sea will die, or it will be as if the fish in the sea dies. It's a third, a third, a third. It's like, why so oddly specific if it's not to be taken literally? And,
people will say, well, God can be that precise in the way he does things, but come on, that's not how history is. And, if God works within history, and he can do things exactly, but if there are exact patterns going on, a third, a third, a third. Before that, it was a fourth, a fourth, a fourth, right? And then a third, a third, a third. Well, then that should tell you that, okay, there's obviously a deliberate symbolic pattern going on here. What is that?
Especially understanding that the Hebrews used numbers symbolically, like simultaneously with normal language. Like it was a part of the modern vernacular to use numbers as symbolism all the time, like way more so than it is for us. It's such a foreign concept, but it was a way of thinking and speaking. Numbers were symbolic in all kinds of things.
Absolutely. So we talked about mountains before, and how mountains are actually cosmic connection points between heaven and earth. A lot of the ancient people, including the Jews, understood gods resided on mountains, and Yahweh had Mount Sinai, right? So it wasn't any different. And then Mount Zion became God's mountain when the temple was there, right? So the notion of mountain here is a reference to kingdoms, and often a reference to the cosmic rule of deity of some kind. But it's interesting that this is very reminiscent of what Jesus himself had actually said. Now, first of all, a mountain was used as a metaphor for Jerusalem all throughout the Old Testament. For instance, Zechariah 8:3, thus says the Lord, I have returned to Zion and will dwell in the midst of Jerusalem, called the faithful city and the mountain of the Lord of hosts, the holy mountain. So Jerusalem, the city, is the holy mountain. It's always referred to that way. But it's interesting because in Matthew 21, Jesus is actually talking about judgment. And you see a lot of his parables and references refer to judgment. And so many times Christians will read these and they just assume, oh, that has to do with going to heaven or hell. But it isn't. Most of his parables have to do with judgment on Jerusalem that was coming. Yeah. And so, for example, he's out there in Matthew 21, verse 19. He sees a fig tree by the wayside. He goes, the fig tree isn't producing anything but leaves. And he says, may no fruit ever come from you again, and the fig tree withered at once. Now, in context, he's been giving these parables about judging Israel in Matthew, right? And this is another case where it's like, they ask him, how did the fig tree wither at once? And Jesus said, truly I say to you, all right, if you have faith and do not doubt, you will not only do what has been done to the fig tree, and then he's going to say something, but let me just make the point here that so he's basically saying Israel has not produced the fruit of faith in Messiah. And so it's being cursed. That's what this is. It's a symbol of that. And why? Because you have to have faith. Well, if you don't have faith in Messiah, you don't have faith, right? But it's interesting because he ties that same faith by saying, right after that, but even if you say to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, it will happen. Now that many people, some Christians say, oh, that can literally happen. Most Christians acknowledge, okay, yeah, that's symbolic of saying, the great things can be accomplished if you have faith in God, and God's the one who pulls it off. But nonetheless, God does great things. So there they can understand the symbolism, but there's more to it than that, because they were in Jerusalem, and that was considered God's holy mountain, Mount Zion. And so I think that there is a symbolic reference here that being Mount Zion is going to be taken up and thrown into the sea, just like it says so in Revelation. A great mountain burning with fire, there's that fire of judgment again, was thrown into the sea. So this is another, all throughout Revelation, we see these references to different ways of describing symbolically the judgment on Jerusalem.
But just real quick, as a kid, let's get into the human side of Brian real quick. Sure. As a kid, like most Christians growing up, were you raised in church? Did you come from a Christian family?
No.
Okay. So how old were you approximately when you were regenerated, had a salvation experience?
Probably 17.
Okay. So young enough. I was surrounded. I went to a youth group, and I will never forget. That verse always stuck out to me as kids, because we almost looked at it like King Arthur's Excalibur. Whose faith is the strongest? Right? Yeah. It was almost like, are we strong enough to move that mountain? Is our faith the faith that was prophesied? And to look at, when we're going to youth camp or whatever, to look at that mountain, I can't tell you how many times I went ahead and gave it a go. And I used that, and I was like, I guess I'm not faithful enough. Did you ever do that as a kid?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay. All right. I'm not alone.
Wow. Maybe I believed it was still hyperbole, but I still feel like, wow, if I had faith, then I could get great things done. And I do think that the meaning there is it's not about your faith; it's the one in whom you have faith. That's what makes. So it's not about your faith,
Yeah. So I just want to say I'm glad to hear that you did that too, and I'm not alone on this show.
Yeah. No, you're not the only one. But just some more examples of how Mount Zion was equated. So this mountain is not just a mountain, a generic mountain. It's literally reference to the mountain of the house of the Lord, because Mount Zion was equated with the temple. Jeremiah 50 verse 28, he says, a voice, they flee and escape from the land of Babylon and declare in Zion the vengeance of the Lord our God, vengeance for his temple. So there it is, Zion, Mount Zion equated with the temple. There's lots of other cases where this is the case, just to make the point that God often refers to his temple and his holy city as mountain, the mountain of the house of the Lord, right? So that's why the temple and the city are all one, and that's why they are all thrown into the fire. So the city and the temple are burned, basically. That's just the point I wanted to make, And there are other cases in the Bible where, like for instance, Babylon is described as a burning mountain. In very similar terms in Jeremiah 51:25. Behold, I'm against you, Yahweh says, O destroying mountain. That's Babylon. Declares the Lord, which destroys the whole earth. I will stretch out my hand against you and make you a burnt mountain.
Is that another instance of the difference between earth and land? Is it used the same way?
Yes and no. Remember, my argument is it's the word land, and that's what it should be all throughout. However, land can mean all that they knew or understood to be, right? It's not it could be local. So context does determine.
Yeah, if you happen to stumble on this one first, you guys, go back to the previous episode where Brian fully goes into all of the passages where earth and land are not necessarily interchangeable, but anyway.
Yeah. So this isn't absolute, and prophecy and poetry and symbolism and hyperbole, these are not exact sciences. It's an impression. That's what Steve Gregg says. I like his term. He says it's an impressionistic painting. It's impressionistic. It's not scientifically precise, because that's not who they are.
Well, and it's tied to the genre, right? And that's
that's the point. The genre.
It's the genre. See, so like, just for people out there that are coming at this from a new perspective, let me give you a little history on my change of perspective. I never realized there were genres in scripture. Growing up, I just read the Bible was just the Bible. And it wasn't until later on doing more study that I realized it was actually important to understand the context in which the book was written. There's a genre to it. And the best way I've been able to explain this to people that don't understand that in relationship to the Bible is that, you take an Agatha Christie novel. And you start studying the pattern of the way Agatha Christie wrote mystery. When everybody gathers in the parlor, you know you're fixing to have a revelation. You know, Hercule Poirot is fixing to make a revelation to all of those about who murdered who, right? You're never confused at the end of that story when they meet in the parlor why somebody didn't rip off their mask and do the Scooby-Doo ending, right? Because you understood the genre of Agatha Christie novels. You understood what was to be expected. You understood the style that she was writing. You read a romance and wonder why nobody showed up and blew up everybody else in an action ending. You don't read a comedy and then wonder why the earth wasn't destroyed by aliens. When you buy a science fiction genre, you are looking at it through the lens of genre. And mystery, romance, all of the comedy, all of it, the same thing. Satire, same thing. So imagine trying to read satire as a hyperliteralist. You'd be so confused reading satire. If you understand you're reading, how many people get taken by a Babylon Bee article, but all of a sudden when they realize it's Babylon Bee, they're like, oh, I get it. This isn't literal. This is a genre.
No, it's funny. I was going to say
satire.
that. Yeah, in fact, that's what, Snopes does. They fact check Babylon Bee and they're trying to give the impression, no, Babylon Bee is trying to deceive you. They're not being satirical. They are, it's such a joke. Yeah. But by the way, that's an example of how genres are manipulated to weaponized. Actually, this is why we cannot just come at this. And even to this day, I still know many Christians will say, "Oh, obviously that's literal. Come on now, you're just saying by saying this is all symbolic. You're just saying it's you don't believe in the Bible. It says what it says. It says all this language." And again, it's look, if you were to read the book of Proverbs and you were to take those as absolutes. That's an example of Proverbs is an example of wisdom literature. Wisdom literature are aphorisms. Aphorisms are general principles that work in life, but they're not absolute. And so consequently, in certain situations, the aphorism might be the opposite. And you would, if you take the book of Proverbs and read it literally, it contradicts itself because it's not intended to be, answer the fool according to his folly. And literally the next verse after it, don't answer a fool according to his folly. Well, that means the Bible contradicts itself if you take it absolutely literally. But you have to understand, no, Proverbs is wisdom literature. It's general truths that aren't always absolute, but in certain situations, they're very applicable. And that's one perfect example of that. But this is the other case where, again, it's just this, they look at this and they just think, everything you're saying, you're just symbolizing everything, and you're making the word of God be of no effect. This is all based on your modern scientific bias of reading text without taking into account the nature of symbolism, apocalyptic prophecy, and all those different various elements that are in the genre, and hyperbole. And it's like you're trying to turn the Bible into a science textbook where everything is precise language, and that's just not the way
the culture that wrote this book, the culture that Jesus was pleased to use to write this book would never have viewed it that way. This genre is apocalyptic. It's an apocalyptic genre. It's apocalyptic genre. Is that right? Would you call it the genre apocalyptic? What's a better term for it?
No, apocalyptic. I mean, it's prophecy, but it does have it's kind of unique. I think actually, so people have said that apocalyptic genre was part of the Second Temple intertestamental literature, which was not biblical, apocalyptic, right? And the Bible is prophecy. But that's not technically true. What happened is the intertestamental period drew from Daniel, which was apocalyptic. Daniel was apocalyptic. Not all prophecy is apocalyptic. Prophecy, but here's the thing. Prophecy is still hyperbolic, still poetic, still symbolic. It's very similar in that sense with apocalyptic. The nature of apocalyptic was this idea that the writers or the symbols are intended to be disguised so that only believers understand it, and unbelievers won't persecute them because they won't understand it. But there's some of that element that I think is going on in Revelation, but not all the time. And Revelation is sort of a mix of apocalyptic and prophecy approach. But the point is that it's not drawing from intertestamental literature. Intertestamental literature and the nature and apocalyptic literature drew from Daniel. So in a way, it originates with the Bible, and it, gets all kinds of varieties, but it just requires you to study it more in depth rather than just, well, this is obviously literal, Well,
it requires study. It requires study, diligent study.
But it's kind of funny because you don't have to be all that ancient to get the sense as you're reading it. I still think, even in a modern context, you look at this and I go, well, that's obviously hyperbolic and symbolic. So what does it symbolize? Sometimes I think these people have been so affected by the worship of science that they're not creative. They don't think creatively, and yet so much of literature is creative. Even that literature which is historic or truthful or whatever is very creative, such as the Book of Revelation.
That's a great point. That's a fantastic point. I learned the other day, I don't want to get too far into this, but the history of Legos. Legos had to start putting directions and specialize in specific things to build, like ships and series, the creative lines, because kids were losing their ability to just take a box of Legos and build whatever they wanted. That has happened with the modern day liberal education system. That's its own conversation, but you're right. People are not creative anymore.
Yeah, it's just, they just read it and it's just, I don't know, it's discouraging because it's so, and the more I read ancient literature, the more obvious it is. The more I get into the mindset, and so maybe you just need to read more than the Bible.
It would seem like it would be more frustrating to a person like yourself that makes their living on their creativity.
Yeah, and I write like this all the time. It's like every writer does this kind of thing, very similarly. You don't have to be writing symbolically to be using a idiom like throwing a mountain into the sea. We have our idioms. It was earth shattering, well, that didn't shatter the earth, but
the sky is falling on me. Like, how's your day? This freaking sky's falling.
Even normal people use these phrases all the time and we accept it. But then all of a sudden you read the Bible, it's just like, and now all of a sudden it has to be scientifically precise.
Yeah.
It just doesn't, I don't see it fitting on any level for this, Now, again, that doesn't mean there aren't that doesn't mean symbolism is arbitrary or allegory. It does refer to specific historical things, but it's describing the impressions, the spiritual reality of what's going on. We're still on the mountain, thrown into the sea. There's one other case of Babylon. I mentioned that Babylon was God described it as a burning mountain. He was going to judge it in Jeremiah 51. Later on in verse 42, he says, the sea has come up on Babylon. She is covered with its tumultuous waves. So we see the precedent in the Old Covenant of when God judges Babylon. He describes it as if it's a burning mountain and he dunks it in the sea and drowns it in the sea. All right. So what's going on here? Well, Jerusalem is now become Babylon, and it's the great mountain that's thrown into the sea. All right. And it's now got that judgment upon it. And there are other elements that they refer to. The sea became blood. All right. Again, if you're a hyper-literalist, you actually have to become a transubstantiationist that the sea literally becomes blood, It doesn't say like blood, it says became blood. But obviously blood is a symbol. And I think that there's, I think this is a reference to the blood guilt for killing Messiah. But it's interesting because, again, I think this is just a sort of a reference to the fact that there are wars going on even in the Sea of Galilee and even in the sea off the shore in the Mediterranean. There were wars because Rome was attacking Israel and destroying them all. And Josephus writes about these ships being destroyed and all this. And he says in Wars 392, the Jews built themselves a great many pirate ships, turned pirate upon the seas near to Syria and Phoenicia and Egypt. And they made those seas unnavigable to all men. So their Jews are going out there and, they're pirating and stuff. But then in Wars 393, he says, now as those people of Joppa were floating about in the sea, this is during the Roman conquest, in the morning there fell a violent storm upon them, and they called by those that sail the black north wind, and there dashed their ships against one another, dashed some of them against the rocks, although the greatest part of them were carried by the waves and dashed to pieces, insomuch that dashed upon the rocks, insomuch that the sea was bloody a long way, and the maritime parts were full of dead bodies. And then in Wars 3:10-9, he writes about the Sea of Galilee, and he says, so there was battles on the Sea of Galilee between the Romans and the Jews. And he says, one might see the lake all bloody and full of dead bodies. And then he talks about the whole, in Wars 4:7-6, the whole of the country through which they had fled was filled with slaughter. The Jordan River could not be passed over by reason of the dead bodies that were in it, or the Dead Sea was also full of dead bodies that were carried down by the river. So you get this notion that war creates literal dead bodies in the sea, right? He's describing that that's what happened. But it makes sense to say the sea became blood, and a third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed, because it's a way of saying all this devastation is coming upon the land, and that's one way of describing it, poetically. So now we're on to the third trumpet, verse 10. The third angel blew his trumpet, and a great star fell from heaven, a blazing like torch, and it fell in the third of the rivers and the springs of the water. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters became, there it is, third of the waters became wormwood, and many people died from the water because it had been made bitter. Now, I think this is, first of all, the great star fell from heaven. I think we're going to see that in chapter 9 right afterwards, and I think that's basically Satan. So, most people,
Brian, this verse, the arguments, the amount of arguments that have been sparked over the years. Like, I'm already having flashbacks to 5th grade arguing with Church of Christ kids over wormwood.
Right. So here's the thing. Again, John is steeped in Old Testament. He's writing he's comparing what's going to happen to Exodus, because God's going to bring his people out of Egypt and judge it. So he's referring to, I think there's a couple elements here that this may be about. And I already mentioned the bodies filling the waters, and that's a bitterness of it shows death filling the waters. That's bitterness, right? That's one way of saying it. But I think that there's either a reference to Mara, the bitter waters of Mara, when Israelites were in the desert and they were complaining, and the water was bitter and it died, and God said, throw this log in and it sweetens the water, right? So there's sort of a veiled reference to that. But I think this is a reference to the other major thematic premise that we keep seeing throughout Revelation, which is the law of jealousy for an adulterous wife. I've been saying Israel is considered an adulterous wife, ultimately a harlot, and God is judging her for unfaithfulness. And there was a law in the law of God, Numbers 5, verses 17 and onward, and it was called the law of jealousy. And the idea was that it's actually quite strange. It's one of those passages where you go, that sounds like magic or something, but whatever. This is what God did. The priest shall take holy water. So if a husband is jealous and he thinks his wife is committing adultery, but we don't know for sure, he says, a priest shall take holy water in a vessel, take some of the dust that is on the floor of the tabernacle. This is the holy house of God, right? So it's a symbol of God's holiness. Take that dust from the floor, put it into water, and then the priest sets it before the woman, unbinds the hair of the woman's head, and she basically has to drink the water of bitterness. It's called the water of bitterness. And that brings a curse. And then later it says that so basically she's made to drink the water of bitterness that becomes the curse, and the water brings the curse that shall enter her and cause bitter pain. The idea was that if she was innocent, it says in the text, actually, if she's innocent, she'll be okay. But if she's guilty, she'll have bitterness in her bowels, and she'll actually get sick and maybe even die. Yeah, this is weird and strange, but just know that John's drawing from the imagery, I think. Since he's talking about Israel being an adulterous wife, this is his way of saying she's going to get the law of jealousy from the law of God. He's using the law of God to condemn her. And I think that's what this is a reference to, is that again, the adulterous theme that's going throughout Revelation.
That's interesting.
Many people died from the water because it had been made bitter. And yeah, again, the dead bodies filled the water and filled the land and all that kind of stuff. But again, this is basically describing different aspects of the spiritual reality, what's going on in Israel as they're being slaughtered by the Romans and being judged for rejecting Messiah. Then the fourth angel in verse 12 blew his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, and a third of the moon, and a third of the stars.
Sorry, let me, on the wormwood subject. So being forced to drink the water and the number of deaths, do you think that symbolically is implying the guilt of those that are forced to drink it? I mean, it's also like, is it a pronouncement of guilt as well? Like just guilty?
Yes, no, that's what I mean. In the law of jealousy, if she drank the waters that had the dust of the temple in it, and she didn't get sick, she was innocent.
Okay.
But if it became bitter and she became sick, she was guilty of adultery. See? So he's saying Israel is guilty of adultery. That's what he's saying here.
It's a pronouncement of guilt. Guilty.
Yeah.
Dead.
Yeah. The bitterness in the stomach of Israel because she's committed adultery. And this is one of the evidences against her. Because remember, God says at least 2 witnesses in order to justify capital punishment. We got the 2 witnesses coming up in chapter 11, but there are other witnesses, and this is one of them.
Just on the off chance that somebody goes back and is watching this and hears Brian just repeated himself, and that somehow I missed it the first time. I just want to say that in the course of these conversations, as I'm reading this, my brain works extra hard, and sometimes it works too hard for its own good, and I miss the answer that I'm looking for when he's talking about it. So I don't know if that was said twice or not, but if it was, you're welcome. Anyway,
that's okay. Continue. We all need things twice. The fourth angel blew his trumpet in verse 12, and a third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, a third of the stars. So a third of their light may be darkened, and a third of the day might be kept from shining. Now, we've already talked about how the sun, moon, and stars, heavenly bodies symbolize governmental rule in general, okay? Whether it's Daniel 8, verse 10, the host of heaven, being referenced to the governmental rules, or Numbers 24:17, where he talks about a star shall come out of Jacob and a scepter, all these things, in Judges when kings are at war, it says the stars are at war, right? So this is a reference to the fact that when the land of Israel, they had all these governances around there, its various cities, and then various Jewish generals who watched over those cities. Well, as Rome went through the land, they devastated and burned down all the cities and therefore all the rulers, right? And they killed all the rulers until they ultimately got to Jerusalem and did the same. And so this is just another one of those expressions of the cosmic collapse that symbolizes the fall of the rulers, which are symbolized in sun, moon, and stars. And as well as the Mosaic system, in a sense. So for instance, let me tell you this. No, I'll just skip that. But just, and to remind you, we talked about Matthew 24 in the very first or 2 episodes. This is another reference to what Jesus was saying, because remember I said that Revelation is an extrapolation of Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse. So Jesus said immediately after the tribulation, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the heaven, the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And the powers of the heavens being shaken is that notion of covenant change, but also it includes the authorities and the rulers falling from power, because God is overthrowing Israel with Rome, right? So this is another symbolic way of reinforcing that notion. Then verse 13, then I heard an eagle crying with a loud voice as it flew directly overhead, woe, woe to those who dwell on the land at the blast of the other trumpets that the 3 angels are about to blow. The only thing I want to bring out here is the eagle flying. Remember in Matthew 24:28, Jesus says, where the corpse is, the eagles gather, and some that might be a reference to that Rome actually had eagles on their standards, and the corpse of Israel, the corpse of a dead religion, was eaten up by those Roman eagles, so to speak. But is that what this is here? I don't know. I don't have much to say other than there's that phrase again, those who dwell on the land, and that's the land of Israel, not the earth as a globe. So now we get to the 5th angel, and we're in a new chapter, chapter 9, verse 1. And I saw a star fall from heaven to earth. Oh, there it is again. That same star that fell from heaven to earth. So you see, even here, it's a repetition of imagery used in different contexts. Repetition, recapitulation. He was given the key to the shaft of the bottomless pit, or the abyss. He opened the shaft of the pit, and from the shaft rose smoke like the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened with the smoke from the shaft. You know, this is probably Satan, and we'll see as we go on. It seems pretty clear that he is, but nevertheless, Jesus said in Luke 10, Jesus said in his ministry, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. That's the only other place where you hear about this notion of falling from heaven to earth. Behold, I have given you authority to tread on serpents and scorpions and all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall hurt you. The idea there was that in the coming of the ministry of Christ and how he bound Satan, and they had power over evil, over these evil things, it's because Satan lost his power because of the arrival of Messiah. Now, that didn't mean that Satan still couldn't do things. It's just in the context of the kingdom of God, Satan has no power over his people. And Revelation, we're going to see also later more about this. But
coincidentally, that verse there in Matthew 24, I learned today that there was a man named Edward Irving who was one of the forerunners to the J.N. Darby saga in history that preached. Edward Irving was responsible for some of the first prophecy conferences, and there's a very memorable sermon where he preached that verse as it was thundering and lightning, and it went straight to the feelers of everybody in that congregation, who pretty much threw sound doctrine out the window and ended up thinking that it was some sort of sign that God was ordaining his position in prophecy. And the Edward Irving kind of thing ended up turning into the J.N. Darby thing, which took 1828. That's the first reference I've ever seen, 1828, to anybody preaching Matthew 24 with a futurist style. Anyway, I just thought that was an interesting side note. So
yeah, definitely. So you see the smoke of a great furnace. Again, these are references to Sodom, because Sodom was used as the smoke of a great furnace going up and fire and brimstone. So the notions of judgment and connecting it to Sodom is always sort of a subtle background as well. And the sun and the air were darkened, and et cetera. And then the locusts came out. From the smoke came locusts on the earth. Now, there's a lot of debate about these two, and I think that they're probably demons. They're a symbolic reference to demons. And they're using, but I think that remember, Exodus, there's a lot of Exodus reference. He's going to make a lot of reference to plagues, water turning to blood, locusts. There's even frogs. We talked about the 3 demon spirits that are frogs. Yeah. So he's drawing this imagery from the plagues of Exodus. Why? Because Israel has become Egypt. So now she is the one getting the plagues. Get it? Got it? Good. So the locusts are symbolic of the demons that he wants to talk about. It's a demon infestation of Israel. Satan is the ruler of demons, right? Matthew 12:24. But think about this. When Messiah came, he was casting out demons, particularly even into the abyss. Remember that? Don't send us into the abyss. Well, Jesus would cast out demons and send them into the abyss. And this is what the abyss is now being opened up. So this Satan has been allowed to open up the pit where the demons were being thrown. The demons were cast out to purify the land for Israel. That's what was going on. I'm sorry, to purify the land for Messiah. But now they're allowed to come back. Why are they allowed to come back? Because Jesus explained it in Matthew 12. He said, when an unclean spirit has gone out of a person, it passes through waterless places, and it says, I will return to my house from which I came. And when it comes, it finds the house empty, swept, and put in order. Then it goes and brings 7 other spirits more evil than itself, and they enter and dwell there. And the last state of that person is worse than the first. So this idea of 7-fold evil, you've cast it out, but it comes back 7-fold. But then the last verse, Jesus says, so also it will be with this evil generation. So Jesus is literally saying this parable he's talking about casting the demons out and they come back 7-fold. he's talking about this generation. He's coming and casting out the demons, but they're going to all come back because they have not cleaned their house truly, and it's going to come back sevenfold. And that's what I think this is a reference to. Obviously, it's more than sevenfold, but again, that's the point. It's coming back like hell on earth because they never repented and never accepted Messiah, right? So that's sort of the principle that I think is going on here.
Well, and it's something most people don't seem to understand, especially with sort of the modern day demonology obsession, in relationship to lots of other things in the conspiracy community. But God is the only one that restrains the gates of hell from sweeping mankind. I mean, he's the only one that actually physically restrains that, but he's known to use that for judgment. I think, and I could be using this completely wrong. I've been interested in looking more into it, but I haven't. There's a passage in the Septuagint that's somehow translated, I think, that God has reserved a portion of the giants for judgment, and some people have connected the spirits of the Nephilim, Raphaim, to the demonic. I don't know if that's real. I've never really been able to fully explore that in depth. If so, that would be some biblical evidence of something very literal that is explaining God can use demons for judgment. But as I was reading Josephus, it was fascinating as I was looking at this locust swarm idea as being related to the demonic. When you start looking at some of the specifics of the things that were happening in the city, nobody was safe. Not only did you have factions of zealots slaughtering everybody in the streets, you had the Romans that were launching things over it. If you stayed in the city, you were about to die. If you left the city, you were about to die. And on top of that, you had these lunatics, these roaming bands of transvestites, guys that dress like women, carried swords under their tunics or whatever. They would randomly lash out at people, stab them on the street. It was one of the most, I don't know of anything more demonic. And as I'm looking at current events with the modern day sort of the trans movement and the way these riots are happening, half of these, I can't help but watch some of these clips on the internet and think about the destruction of Jerusalem and what it was like to live next to such insanity. I feel like what's happening today is a good representation of the same kind of demonic things that were happening back then. And you might differ on that, I don't know. But studying Josephus definitely seems to record a massive amount of demonic activity in the city that was unrestrained. It's like God just released his grip let the leash off, and here it goes. It just swarmed the city.
Yeah, in fact, let me read some of that to you. I was going to do that anyway, because you're right. I think that this is an expression of that demonic infestation that I think was being prophesied. Josephus Wars 781. For those that were partners with them, he's talking about the warriors in the triple civil war going on in the city by the Jews. Those who were partners in their rebellion, those were the rebellion of the Sicarii and the Zealots, joined also with them in the war against the Romans, and went farther lengths with them in their impudent undertakings against them. And when they were again convicted of dissembling in such their pretenses, they still more abused those that justly reproached them for their wickedness. And indeed, that was a time most fertile in all manner of wicked practices, insomuch that no kind of evil deeds were then left undone, nor could anyone so much as devise any bad thing that was new. So deeply were they all infected and strove with one another in their single capacity and in their communities, who should run the greatest lengths of impiety towards God and in unjust actions toward their neighbors, the men of power oppressing the multitude, and the multitude earnestly laboring to destroy the men of power. The one part were desirous of tyrannizing over the others, and the rest of offering violence to the others, and of plundering such as were richer than themselves. It goes on, but you get the point. And this is the description of what's going on by the Jews amongst themselves. So you're right. That's what I think is an expression here of, once you reject Messiah, you leave, God's leaving you alone, and you become demonically infested. Power of scorpions, they have like the power of scorpions. It's a common image of danger in the desert, But it says, do not harm the grass of the earth or any green plant or tree, but only those people who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. Well, how does that work? Well, what did we say earlier? The 144,000 were sealed by God's seal. Who were they? They were the remnant who were the Jewish believers in Messiah who left the city because Jesus said to flee when you see the abomination of desolation. So those who were sealed with the seal of God, so to speak, they were gone. So only those who were left were basically those who were not Christians. Now, it doesn't mean that there weren't some Christians in the city, because there may have been. And in my novel series, I actually argue that there probably were some Christians who wanted to go there and help the sick and dying, and they didn't care that they would die in helping them, right? So there's
Alexander and Cassandra.
Yes, Alexander and Cassandra. Absolutely.
Characters from Brian's book, sorry.
Yeah, my two favorite. So there's that. And then it says they were allowed to torment them for 5 months, but not to kill them. And their torment was like the torment of a scorpion when it stings someone. And in those days, people will seek death and will not find it. Again, this is not literal science, okay? They will long to die, but death will flee from them. What he's describing is there's a civil war going on, and it's not going to destroy them because they're still going to be able to fight against the Romans. But they are killing each other to such a degree and starving each other, etc. It's suffering. It's like, okay, they're not going to die in that they're going to all die and be lost, etc. They're still going to be alive as a body of people to fight the Romans, but the devastation that they put upon themselves will be the equivalent of that, the equivalent of torment. And it's something interesting here. The 5 months, it says for 5 months. What does that mean? Well, it so happens that I think that there are 5 months in which locusts, have their say in the Middle East. But I think it's more specific than that, actually. The siege of Jerusalem itself lasted about 5 months. So here's what Gentry writes. He says, the time frame that Josephus provides from Titus's initial siege until the collapse of Jerusalem begins a few days prior to Passover on the 14th of April, AD 70, and lasts until the 8th of September, which is AD 70, little over 5 months. So I think that that's kind of what this is referring to, in the sense that while they're besieged by Rome in Jerusalem, they are like, the demonic infestation, they're killing each other, they're torturing each other, all this kind of stuff. All right. But they're not, they're seeking death, but not finding. Well, obviously there were people who were dying, but the point is they're not getting relief or redemption or freedom. They're remaining in the city, and they're still besieged by Rome. And ultimately, they're going to get all fully wiped out. Right. And then in verse 7, he says, in the appearance of the locust. Okay, now he starts to describe it. And again, this is something a lot of people, I don't want to, we could spend the whole rest of the time talking about this, but, I want to talk about other things too. But the point here is just, they look like horses prepared for battle. Well, yeah, because maybe it's a reference to the fact that the zealots in the Sicarii who were killing people were warriors, right, in the city. Or maybe it's just this idea of the demons were very violent, and they brought upon violence on their heads. Some had what looked like crowns of gold. Now here's where it says, all throughout it describes them, it uses the word like. They had like crowns of gold, like human faces, like women's hair, like lion's teeth. So this is obviously not literal, right? It's obviously simile or symbolic. And so that's the first thing to say. And then, you can look up each of these things and find various elements, like crowns of gold, I think probably refers to symbolic for victory. Not necessarily, it could be kingship, but in this case, I think it's more like we talked about before, victory. Or maybe it's those demonic rulers and principalities that Paul talks about, right? They are the kingly demonic principalities, and maybe they are part of this whole package that's going on there, because they have not been eliminated yet. And historically speaking, they haven't been done away with. So it might be a reference to them, but also the human faces. I think that maybe suggests intelligence, maybe a reference to the fact that, okay, these demons are inhabiting humans, right? Maybe it's just referring to that. Hair like women's hair. This could be another veiled reference to the law dealing with adultery again, right? Remember how I was saying, the adultery law, well, a dishonorable woman had to cut her hair off. Or when you engaged in the law of adultery, you had to let down your hair, right? So there's this notion of maybe that's another symbolic reference to unfaithfulness. And their teeth were like lion's teeth, and that's well known for being a symbol of aggressive power. Lions devour, right? So they're devouring. This is what demons do, This is what they're like. Breastplates of iron. Maybe that's a reference to connecting to the fact that there's a lot of the warriors in the city causing the civil war, you know, so breastplates of iron is a reference to warrior-like status, right? The noise of their wings was like the noise of many chariots with horses running to battle. Well, it says the noise like many chariots. It could be a reference to many chariots, but it doesn't have to, because it says it was like that. But the idea was that in antiquity, the attack of the war horses was a signal of approaching devastation, because when you had cavalry descend upon you, it was, they were powerful, right? Tails like stings like scorpion, and here it is again, their power to hurt people for 5 months is in their tails. So see how it's like this redundancy, where we were talking about the 5 months just in the paragraph before, now it's talking about them again. So it sort of repeats. It goes back and talks and expands on previous passages.
Well, and it just highlights. I mean, some people, theology is lacking so much. They don't see it as God being sovereign and the only one that's capable of foreordaining death. Nobody dies outside of God's sovereign foreordination. God is purposefully allowing this to transpire without killing everybody. Death flees from them because God has chosen to force them to live in agony. This is a horror. Like the theme here is, I think that
that doesn't mean nobody will die.
Yeah.
It's talking corporately. It's talking corporately. That means they're not destroyed yet. They're still alive, going on, even though there are a lot of people who died throughout there. They, as a corporate entity, did not die.
And that's what's so terrifying. They're not dead yet because God doesn't want them dead yet. It's like longer. And that's terrifying to me. That's a terrifying side of God I'm glad I will never have to see, Brian.
Amen. Amen. And so here's where we get to the king of them. I'm sorry, they have as king over them the angel of the bottomless pit. His name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in Greek he is called Apollyon. This is why I think he's basically Satan, Satan was control of the demons, right? So that's why locusts are probably demons. And so, for instance, king. Satan is described as the ruler of demons. He's the king. Destroyer. Satan is described as a destroyer in the Bible. Like, for instance, Hebrews 2:14. That Jesus became flesh and partook of the same things, that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is, the devil. 1 Peter 5:8 talks about Satan's like an adversary, like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour, right? So, and there's other, Paul delivers a man over in 1 Corinthians 5. He delivers a man to Satan for the destruction of the flesh. So Satan's a devourer, a destroyer. He's described that way. He's also, the name means literally adversary. It actually means the adversary. And I read a very fascinating scholarly paper that described, it's not just like he's an adversary in a court of law. That's true. But in particular, if you study the concept of the adversary throughout the Old Testament, it actually means attacking adversary, like as in violence, and which sort of adds a whole new dimension.
Yeah.
That concept of Satan and adversary in the Old Testament is a violent attacker, not just at someone who's accusing you, but he's violently attacking you. And of course that fits right here, right? Obviously it does. So that's what I kind of think that whole passage is talking about. And there's more to it than that. Obviously the names Apollyon and Abaddon and all that. But Apollyon, is a derivative of Apollo, and Nero, his patron deity was Apollo. And so there's some interesting play of symbols going on there. So then verse 12, the first woe is past. Behold, 2 woes are still to come. Then the 6th angel blew his trumpet, and I heard a voice from the 4 horns of the golden altar before God, this is in heaven, saying to the 6th angel, release the 4 angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates. So the 4 angels who had been prepared for the hour, the day, the month, and the year, there it is again, your sovereignty of God, right, were released to kill 1/3 of mankind. Okay, so something interesting here. The river Euphrates is a very fascinating concept. There's a few things rolled up in here, but first of all, the angels. I think these are probably symbols of the principalities and powers, and I think it's in reference to the Roman armies, actually, because first of all, why Euphrates? Remember how the River Euphrates shows up in one of the seal judgments, I think, or was it one of the bowl judgments? Anyway, there's that repetition going on. But anyway, number one, Euphrates was the northern border of Israel. So that's an important sort of geographical reference. It is basically symbolic, but I do think it might be historically accurate. This is one of those cases where it's both and. Number two, Euphrates has long served as apocalyptic imagery of God's threat against Israel with invading forces. All right. There's dozens of passages here where he talks about, for instance, when Assyria, through Sennacherib, came and destroyed Israel and took her away to captivity. Assyria came to take Samaria into exile from the river Euphrates. Babylon came from the river from the river Euphrates when they came to take Israel into exile. So it's this, the foe from the north is a common thing that when they wanted to invade Israel, they would often invade from the north, and they would often come through or by the river Euphrates. So it's sort of a reference to that reality. Well, interestingly, as a matter of fact, Rome had 4 brigades of soldiers at the Euphrates River at this time in the 1st century. They were finally called down by Titus. I don't remember at what time they came, but they were finally called by Titus to come and join him for the final, because Titus was destroying the countryside along with Vespasian. And ultimately, though, they were called from the Euphrates for the final besiegement of Jerusalem, right? But it also so happens that there were 4 legions that surrounded Jerusalem for that 5-month siege. 4 legions or 4 brigades from the Euphrates. These certainly are strange coincidences in my mind. But lastly, Rome's dominion itself extended to the Euphrates. So there's that connection there. So I think what this is referring to is that this is a reference to that final showdown of the last 5 months. And God is in, by the way, you've said this time and again, but I think it bears repeating here. It says that they've been prepared for the hour, the day, the month, etc., to kill a third of mankind. God is the one who's doing this. It is his angels who are releasing these things to occur. So it's not that Satan is in control. People often, I think, naive Christians often think that, when things are really bad, it's like, oh, Satan's in control. God must have given it to Satan for a while, or whatever. No, God's always in control of all these judgments. He's the one doing. Now, he uses Satan or evil demons to do his purposes, but he's the one who's doing the judgment here. And when it says to kill a third of mankind, this is another one of those bad words. The plural for mankind, anthropon, means people. Killing a third of the people of the land, not mankind. What do we read when we read mankind? We think of the globe and everyone on it. And that's not what this word has to mean. I think it's referring to the people of the land, a third of the people of the land. Again, symbolic number, but it's just showing the intensity is growing. More and more people are being killed, more things are being destroyed. And then we get into the number of the mounted troops, and this is the 200 million number. It says the number of mounted troops was twice 10,000 times 10,000, which is 200 million. I heard their number, and this is how I saw the horses in my vision and those who rode them. We'll get to that in a second. But so there's 200 million men. There was a time in the past when futurists like Hal Lindsey said, well, China has 200 million men they have enough for an army of 200 million men. So it's going to be literal. It's going to be literal. I think this is a symbolic of the spiritual power of the forces of Rome, basically. It's a reference to the absolute conquering power, even over Israel, who should be God's people, but in this case, they're being judged, right? But it's not, I'm not just arbitrarily saying that, no, it's just symbolic of spiritual power. Because this language, twice 10,000 times 10,000, has a precedent. Aha, of course it always does, doesn't it? I think there's a wordplay here going on about God's heavenly host. Because God's heavenly hosts are often referred to as 10,000 times 10,000 or thousands upon thousands. So let me give you an example. Psalm 68:17. The chariots of God are twice 10,000. There it is, that same reference.
Yeah.
Thousands upon thousands. And the Lord is among them. Sinai is now in the sanctuary. Deuteronomy 33:2 says, the Lord came from Sinai. Both of these are reference to Sinai. The Lord came from Sinai and dawned upon Seir. He shone from Mount Paran. He came from the 10,000s of holy ones with flaming fire at his right hand. And then, of course, you've got Enoch and Jude where it talks about God will come with thousands of his holy ones and execute judgment. But you see how at least this phraseology is used, and it's used in reference to Sinai, which is the covenant, right? But in particular, I think it's saying that in the same way that God's holy heavenly host will protect his people or bring forth his glory, this is like twice 10,000 times 10,000. It's saying that glorious number is going to be used for judgment now. But in particular, it's that reference to that heavenly host, which is another reference to the judgment, But does that mean that these are God's heavenly hosts? I don't think so because of the description of them. But what I'm trying to get at is, I think it's a wordplay. In other words, it's saying in the same way that God's heavenly host is twice 10,000 or 10,000 times 10,000. This is twice 10,000 times 10,000. In other words, it's spiritual authorities and powers that are amassing their wrath that's coming down upon the city.
So as I'm thinking about this for the first time, bear with me.
Oh, no, sure.
Could it also be a reference to God using these armies in the same capacity that he would use his angelic hosts in judgment?
Yes.
Like him sending them, right? It's almost like in the same way that he could send angelic hosts to destroy these destroyers. It's almost like the same terminology for him using angelic hosts is being used, but using Roman legions. It's still him operating. He's just using. Is that number assigned to God sending troops into battle?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And all throughout, we have made reference to the fact that God often uses pagan nations to judge other nations, or pagan nations to judge Israel. And that's exactly what he did with Babylon. That's exactly what he did with Assyria. And that's what he's doing with Rome against Israel.
It's almost like this is a number attached to God's army. Like this is like
exactly. That's exactly what I'm saying.
Okay.
What I'm saying. Is this literally this army, or I don't know, but it's using that language because it says they wore breastplates, color of fire and sapphire and sulfur, and the heads of the horses were like lion heads, and fire and smoke and sulfur. Fire and smoke and sulfur. That's the language of Sodom. That's God's judgment, right? Fire and smoke and sulfur. It's the same language as Sodom. And all, lion's heads, the attacking, all this. Maybe that's a reference to the fact that, like the way I would see it is like what you're saying is this is God's heavenly host, but he's also doing it through the Roman soldiers. And he's using very, poetic imagery to describe the earthly soldiers, in terms of spiritual descriptions, Or it could be what you're saying. It could simply be more a reference to spiritual warriors who are behind the physical destruction of what's going on, because there are a couple passages I want to read to you. One is Josephus, not the Bible. Josephus writes in Wars 6:5-3. He writes about a vision that people actually saw during the siege of Jerusalem.
Yeah, this is interesting.
He writes this: a certain prodigious and incredible phenomenon appeared. I suppose the account of it would seem to be a fable, were it not related by those that saw it, and were not the events that followed it of so considerable a nature as to deserve such signals. For before sunsetting, chariots and troops of soldiers in their armor were seen running about among the clouds and surrounding the cities. Even Tacitus, the Roman historian who does not believe in Judaism, right? He draws from sources, but in his book Histories 5:3, he writes, of this time, In the sky appeared a vision of armies in conflict of glittering armor. So there, even in non-biblical sources, there's the belief or reference of seeing this vision of spiritual armies. And remember how Elisha's servant opened his eyes and he
say
could
Elijah,
see the spiritual armies around them. That could very well be what this is. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Interesting. And for people that want, that's something that I think is a hard concept for people that haven't studied it, is how strange it would seem to some that are new to this topic that God would take a pagan army and use it to judge his own people. But like any sort of like issue you have with that from like a natural first time perspective, looking at that, so did Habakkuk. In fact, that's the premise of the whole book of Habakkuk, is Habakkuk wrestling with this idea that God's fixing to send Babylon in to destroy his people. And he's like, this is not fair. These people are worse than we are. And he literally wrestles with God about, like, the whole book, which is like 4 or 5 chapters, is Habakkuk wrestling with God about God using foreign armies to come in and judge. And it gets hashed out. And Habakkuk did not do it in a petty, unrighteous, accusatory fashion. There's a real conversation that happens between Habakkuk and where he's settled and understands that this is the wisdom of God in this matter. So if you too are listening to this and say, I got a problem with the way that you guys are, you're portraying God using pagan armies in the destruction of Jerusalem, well, so did Habakkuk. You're in good company. Go read that book. It might actually answer a few things for you.
Yeah. God owns everything, so they're his, whether they like it or not. So in finishing up this particular chapter and passage, it's kind of an interesting final paragraph, because it says, verse 20, the rest of the people, it says mankind, but it's actually the rest of the people who are not killed by these plagues. So we've got all this destruction. In other words, the people who are surviving, right, did not repent of the works of their hands, nor give up worshiping demons and idols of gold and silver and bronze and stone and wood, which cannot see or hear or walk, nor did they repent of their murders or their sorceries or their sexual immorality or their thefts. So it's this just, list of evil sins. And it sounds like it's Gentiles, right? I mean, these are a lot of the phraseology of, making idols with your hands and out of wood, and worshiping demons and idols of gold and sorcery, right? And all this stuff. Again, remember the theme here. He's saying Israel has become Egypt. Israel has become like the Gentiles. They are now the ones who upon whom I am going to visit judgment. I've made them the opposite of what they're supposed to be in my eyes. Not I've made them, but they've made themselves, they have made themselves like the Gentiles, in other words. And let me explain that, because all this phraseology in this last phrase about the rest of the people not killed by the plagues. Number one, this notion of they did not repent of the works of their hands. Well, isn't that what Gentiles do, creating gods and stuff? Well, actually, in Mark 14:58, Jesus refers to, he's comparing his body with the temple, and he says, destroy this temple that is made with hands. I'm sorry, he's talking about the temple. He says, destroy this temple made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands. So that's a reference to the temple, but it's like, then he says, well, they don't realize that he was referring to his own body, right? And so there's in other words, Jesus is laying over the imagery. He's sort of talking about two things at once, isn't he, right? But the idea there of made with your hands is the temple, while it was originally sanctioned by God, once God had made it obsolete, no more temple, Messiah is come, right? Now, that which used to be holy is now an idol made with human hands, right? Because it no longer has the sacredness that it once had under the old covenant. The new covenant has arrived, and so now it's become like an idol. The temple itself is like an idol. Also, the notion of worshiping demons, remember there are passages where he says, in Revelation 2:9 and 3:9, John is calling Jews who don't believe in Messiah, he calls them synagogues of Satan. In other words, they claim to be Jews, but they are lying and they are not Jews. That's what he says. What does that mean? What it means is they're claiming to be Jews, but they don't believe in Messiah, so they're not really Jews, because a true Jew is one who believes in Messiah, right? So he's making that connection. There's that demonic connection. So this idea of worshiping demons is very germane to the Jews in the book of Revelation. And even the idols, making idols. Look, the whole history of Israel was plagued by a history of idolatry.
Yes.
Israel made Asherahs, they did Baal statues and stuff. So this is just this is the end of their long tradition of worshiping idols. Even if it's not literally at the moment, there probably was at the time. I'm not familiar with any exact cases, but my point is he's connecting their current apostasy to their history of apostasy, which includes idols. But also murders. Well, isn't that a generic thing? How is that specific? I think this is probably a reference to the murdering of the prophets. Remember back in Matthew 23, we talked about this. Thus, Jesus telling them, you witness against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your fathers, Jesus says. And then he says, thus you witness against yourselves. Oh, I took the wrong verse here. Oh, no. 35, 36. So that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of Abel to Zechariah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. So there, remember, Jesus was saying, you're guilty of murdering the prophets. And also, they were murdering Christians, right? And then sorceries. That's another one where, again, Israel had a history of sorcery. Just read the story of Jezebel. It's one I wrote a novel on. And, she was literally called, 2 Kings 9:22, what peace then can there be in Israel, says Jehu, so long as the whorings and the sorceries of your mother Jezebel are so many, right? And then, of course, Jezebel shows up in Revelation 2:20, which we kind of briefed over, but, it uses the symbol of Jezebel as this is a symbol of the church that had accepted sorceress type beliefs and such. And then lastly, 6, sexual immorality. I think this is, not lastly, second to last, I think this is a reference to spiritual adultery again. We've already talked about how, in the Old Testament, Israel being unfaithful was considered adultery. But we've also been talking how, look, the whole book of Revelation is saying Israel has become an unfaithful wife. She's turned into a harlot. Therefore, I'm going to divorce her. So the spiritual, I think it's more about the spiritual immorality. Sexual immorality is a symbol for spiritual adultery more than literal sexual immorality. That doesn't mean it's not included, because certainly pagan worship involved both sexual immorality as well as, unfaithfulness, spiritual unfaithfulness. But lastly, theft. That's another one that you go, well, that's pretty generic. There's theft in every culture. But now if you think about it, in this time of history, Jews had basically stole from Christians their identity, right? They persecuted them. They kicked them out. Christians were Jews, and they believed in Messiah, but their identity was stolen from them. And a lot of Jews, they got rid of Christians and they took their land over, and especially when all this stuff was going on, a lot of people left and Jews took their land over. So there's a kind of a theft of the Christian identity by the Jews of that time period. So this is the spiritual language that's used of Israel to describe, again, their guilt on every level of spiritual unfaithfulness and adultery.
That is fascinating. Do you have anything else to add on Revelation? Because I've got a question for you that might be a little outside the wheelhouse. So,
well, I was thinking of finishing chapter 10 because I don't think we have as much to talk about there. I mean, there's you can talk about everything forever, but I think we can go through it pretty quick.
That's fine. Sure. Let's do that. I just have we got a comment on the last video, and I thought I was saving it to the end. I for some reason, I don't know why I assumed we were just doing 2 chapters, but I feel like maybe this is a good moment to bring it up, just because maybe. Some people have a real hard time, and I hope I'm not being unfair to the person that wrote this comment. I feel like preterism is naturally sits in contention to the modern Hebrew roots system. And the Torah observant culture that's really heavily into this there's still sort of a dispensational way of thinking about things and going back to the Old Covenant. Anyway, this question seems to reflect a mindset that comes out of Hebrew roots, but I just wanted to address it. it says, my issues is Yah does not break covenant. He did not divorce Israel to marry someone else. That's not biblical. And I don't really fully understand the Hebrew roots way of thinking, but they really are enjoying the series. The rest of the comment seems to be really enjoying the series, but they're having a problem with this idea of divorce and looking at this through the lens of God breaking covenant, which you and I both know that is not happening. God is not he's not a covenant breaker. He's a covenant keeper. But just on the off chance that this is a larger confusion with some that are watching this, I wanted to take a moment to address the fact that this is not God breaking covenant. So I'm throwing it to you.
I'm trying to see if that can fit into something we're going to talk about later. But
okay. And feel free, if you don't want to answer it right now, that's fine. We can answer it at the end or some other show. I just want to throw it out there so I don't forget. Because I do think that's if that's a misconception people have going through this, they're going to completely miss the point of what's actually happening. That's a really important detail.
No, I hear you. I totally agree. And I definitely think it needs to be addressed. Absolutely. Well, let me just address it. Like, maybe we can talk about it more later. But I don't think I have. I know I've got. Well, first of all, when we get to the harlot, we're definitely going to talk a lot about that because that's.
Well, we can write it down write it down for when you think it'll fit, and just don't forget it. Add it into your notes. We don't have to talk about it right now, but
there's a couple of things. What was I thinking of that were in reference to that though? That we've kind of already addressed. Oh, well, number one, no, covenant. This notion of God doesn't break covenant is not biblical. The idea is that covenants are precisely based on if you do this, then I'll do this, right? And so God literally said in His covenant. This is why I wish. Maybe if I was more prepared, I could find them. But in Deuteronomy, he gives this it's the famous blessings and curses passage. I don't know if you know where that is, but he goes, if you obey me, you will get the fruit of the land and you'll conquer and you'll do this and that. And it goes on for pages and then it goes, but if you do not obey my statutes, if you do not remain in me, I will bring these curses upon you. I will I will, plague, famine, war. And he even says, I will bring a foreign power upon you and they will besiege you and destroy your holy city. I mean, he literally says that in Deuteronomy, right? So that's the covenant. So he's not breaking covenant. If Israel is not faithful and they violate the covenant, God's covenant is that he will curse them, right? And then he even says over and over and throughout the Old Testament, again, I would have to get these passages for you, but and I have them, but not at my fingertips. And that is over and over again. He says, you've been unfaithful. I'm going to divorce you. I'm going to divorce you. People who are not my people will become my people, right? He says this over and over again. But it's interesting because even then, that's the point of divorce. The divorce is part of the covenant. In other words, God is fulfilling the covenant. The covenant says if you are if you are faithless or unfaithful, and you have more than two witnesses to that unfaithfulness, you can engage in capital punishment against a spouse, right? And that's what God is doing here. He's saying, look, I have witnesses that you've been unfaithful and you refuse to repent, and now I am just in being able to bring you to capital punishment and bring you to that point of destruction. And that's why he can marry a new wife, because the old wife is dead. So what I'm saying is all that storyline is precisely what the law of God prescribes, and God is actually following it. Honestly, nobody's ever kept covenant. No human's ever kept covenant. So God can just destroy us all if he wants, and he's fine, and he's still just, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah. But all I'm saying is technically, actually, he is fulfilling covenant by divorcing and executing. He doesn't marry until he executes Israel, so to speak.
And that's the thing I want to stress to anybody that's confused about this is, if anything, this highlights the covenant breaking character attributes that we have, not God. This shows that this is the justice of God. This upholds. This is the holiness of God on display. I cringe when I hear questions like that. Not in some sort of judgy way, but because if in any respect you can look at this in almost even in your mind, even if you're not being aggressive about it, accuse God of an injustice here in the transition between these covenants. You don't understand what's happened. This is justice on God's part, not injustice. We are the covenant breakers. God is always a covenant keeper. And so if that's not understood, you don't understand anything about what we've talked about up until this point. So just understand that for those that have been confused and sent questions in.
Very well said. Very well said. Because you're right. That's the point. That's what we've precisely been describing is God is sticking to covenant and he's fulfilling that covenant. And if you think that we're saying he's breaking the covenant, then you're not listening to anything that's being said. Absolutely. That's absolutely true. Because God judges all throughout the old covenant. You can't deny it, In fact, God was ready to destroy his people and Moses stopped him. Wait, don't do it, So,
his justice actually speaks to his goodness because a good God upholds justice. The fact that he's being just in this only speaks to how good he is.
Amen.
So anyway, Michael Horton has a great book as an introduction to covenant theology. I think it's Michael Horton. If anybody's interested out there in looking at, I would assume, Brian, you subscribe to a system of covenant theology?
Yeah.
I'm assuming. Okay.
Yeah.
I do too. So that's more of the Reformed sector, which means we're going to be light years away from Hebrew roots in their concept of covenant. So anyway, if anybody's interested more in the system of theology that we're coming from, you can look up Michael Horton's Introduction to Covenant Theology. It's a great book. Anyway, all right, let's do 10. Let's do chapter 10.
Yeah. Okay, so 10 is we break away and we go back to sort of a new, sort of a piece of a vision, the angel and the little scroll. And this is one where, in terms of fulfillment, I don't think that it necessarily has reference to the kind of things we're talking about, were they fulfilled in the past or in the future, but it's connected. Nevertheless, it says, Then I saw a mighty angel coming down from heaven, wrapped in a cloud with a rainbow over his head, and his face was like the sun, and his legs like pillars of fire. He had a little scroll in his hand, and he set his right foot on the sea and his left foot on the land. Interesting that the English translation has the same word gay that's always been translated earth, and all of a sudden they say land now. And called out with a loud voice, like a lion roaring. When he called out, the seven thunders sounded, and the seven thunders was what I wrote, and I heard a voice saying, seal up what the seven thunders have said and do not write it down. So you've actually got 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls, and 7 thunders. But the reason why we don't talk about the thunders is no one knows what it said because John hid it. So that's the notion of this thing. There's a secret element. It says, and the angel whom I saw standing on the sea and the land raised his right hand to heaven and swore by him who lives forever and ever, who created the heaven that is on the in it and the earth and what is in it and the sea and everything, that there would be no more delay. Remember, we've been talking about that language of coming soon. It's near. Yeah. It just keeps coming up. The language keeps coming up. There's no more delay. There's everything soon and happening, not distance time off. I just want to make and this says, but in the days of the trumpet call to be sounded by the seventh angel, a mystery of God will be fulfilled, just as he announced to his servants, the prophets. Now, I think this mighty angel is Jesus. And there's several reasons why. Angel, the word angel means messenger, right? So it doesn't mean like it's a specific ontological entity. A human could be an angel. If you're bringing the gospel to someone, you're a messenger, you're an angel, right? So number one, there's that. But also Jesus appears as many different images in Revelation. So he appears in Revelation 1 as a heavenly divine figure. In Revelation 5, he appears as a lamb, a lion, and the root of David. In Revelation 14, he appears as the cloud-riding Son of Man, which is, that we've talked about that notion. And then in Revelation 19, he's a horse warrior, a warrior on a horse, right? So the fact that this is not saying Jesus is irrelevant because it's symbolism again, and for whatever reason they're not saying that. But I think these elements of it make it clearly, in my opinion, to be him. So first of all, wrapped in a cloud. Clouds are images of divinity in the Bible. If you're coming on a cloud, we've talked about this. Coming on the cloud, it's God's presence in Psalm 18:11. His darkness is his covering, canopy around him, thick clouds with dark water. He made darknesses. I read that already. Daniel 7:13, the night visions. I saw the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. Clouds are representations of the presence of deity. So that's one strong element that says it's Jesus. The rainbow, right? That's associated with God. And Ezekiel talks about the rainbow being around God. Face like a sun. That literal exact phrase was used of Jesus in Revelation 1:16. In his right hand he held 7 stars. From his mouth came a sharp two-edged sword, and his face was like the sun shining in full strength. So, and it goes on and on. Pillars of fire, I think that could be a reference to the 2 pillars of the temple, and he's the actual fulfillment of the temple. Or it could be the pillars of fire in Exodus. You know how they were guided by the pillar of fire at night? Maybe it's a reference to that, because Exodus imagery. Voice like a lion roaring. He's the Lion of Judah, right? And then lastly, the thundering. His voice was like a thunder. 7 thunders. It's interesting that in Canaanite literature, there was a text called the 7 Thunders of Baal. And it's very well known. It talks about Baal giving these 7 thunders. And as a matter of fact, it kind of connects up with a psalm. And the idea here is not that Jesus is Baal, but it's using storm god imagery to say Baal isn't God, Jesus is God, right? But the point is it's storm god imagery, the 7 thunders. And they're using it here of the person. So only Jesus is the only person who could be God. And then lastly, coming down from heaven, Jesus comes down from heaven. So these are sort of the reasons why I think it's probably Jesus. And then also it says he has his right foot on the sea, left foot on the land. Well, again, this is an expression of the sovereignty of Christ. He's Lord over the land of Israel as well as the sea, and the sea represents the Gentiles. Now, the sea is representative of multiple things in Scripture. It could be chaos, but it's often used of Gentiles. Let's see here. Jeremiah 6:22 through 23 is one example. He's talking about people coming from the north country. There it is again, coming from the north. A great nation stirred from the farthest parts. The sound of them is like the roaring sea. But also it's interesting, Rome comes from the sea technically, But the point here is just that I think it's saying, that he is Lord over the Israelites and the Gentiles as well. He's the Lord over all, right? He raises his hand to heaven. That's swearing in court. Because remember, going all the way back to Revelation, 4 or 5, we're in a court. I think it's a divorce court with a scroll. And this is that court imagery. John's reminding us of we're in this court of law that is, ultimately showing that Israel is guilty and of capital crimes. And no more delay. And then lastly, the mystery of God there, where it talks about the mystery of God would be fulfilled just as he announced to his servants, the prophets. Well, what's the mystery of God? It's the gospel. I got to fix something here for a second. Okay. The gospel is the mystery of the gospel is the inclusion of the Gentiles with Jews in faith in Messiah. Classic passages, Colossians 1:25. I became a minister minister of the gospel. The stewardship from that God has given to me to make known the word of God, fully known, the mystery hidden for ages and generations, but now revealed to the saints. To them God chose them to make known how great among the Gentiles are the riches of the glory of his mystery, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory. And then Romans 16 talks about the secret kept long for ages, now disclosed. Ephesians 3, I think that's my favorite one. Yeah, the mystery. What's the mystery? Ephesians 3:6. The mystery is that the Gentiles are fellow heirs, members of the same body and partakers of the promise in Christ Jesus through the gospel. So he's basically saying the gospel, which is the inclusion of the Gentiles, is fulfilled just as he announced to his servants, the prophets. And this could be a long discussion, I guess, as well, because the idea here is that in the old covenant, it was prophesied that one day the Gentiles would become one with Jews in the kingdom of God, right? And some people say that, well, that hasn't happened yet because God still has to redeem, Israel and stuff. They have this predetermined theological eschatology and stuff. And the point is that the scriptures itself, like the New Testament itself, says, no, the mystery is fulfilled in the gospel. The Gentiles are now one through faith in Christ. And that's it. It's been fulfilled. There is no more Gentiles and Jews. Jews and Gentiles who believe in Jesus are already one. So if you're not part of that body, right? And then the voice says, then the voice that I heard from heaven spoke to him again, saying, take the scroll that is open in the hand of the angel who is standing on the sea and on the land. I think that's probably still that scroll, that divorce scroll, because it's a legal situation again. It reminds us of that past courtroom scene that we already saw. He said, take it and eat it. It will make your stomach bitter, but your mouth it will be sweet as honey. I took the scroll from the hand of the angel and ate it. It was sweet as honey in my mouth. But when I had eaten it, my stomach was bitter. And he says, you must prophesy to many peoples, nations, languages. I think this might be, again, a reference to the ordeal of jealousy over the charges of adultery. He's reminding them that this scroll is that accusation of adultery against Israel, and it's making his stomach bitter because she's guilty. Not because John's guilty, but it's symbolically saying, okay, it's a reminder of that guilt, of why we're doing all this stuff. But it's interesting because it's the same imagery that's used in Ezekiel's vision. When Ezekiel was talking about the first temple being destroyed and Israel going into exile, Ezekiel 3:1-3 says, he said to me, son of man, eat whatever you find here. Eat the scroll. Go speak to the house of Israel. So I opened my mouth, and he gave me the scroll to eat. And he said to me, son of man, feed your belly with this scroll that I gave you and fill your stomach. I ate, and it was in my mouth as sweet as honey. Now, I think I should have kept reading, but I didn't. Son of man, speak the words. There it goes. I didn't get everything I wanted to get in that verse. I went in bitterness and the heat of spirit. Well, anyway, the point is that it's the same sort of scroll, eating the scroll, it's sweet to the taste, right? He's using the same imagery that we have in Ezekiel. I can't find the bitterness that I thought was there. So I'll just have to say that what it is it's a reference to that swallowing of the scroll and the sweetness to the taste. But I'll have to look into that to see if there's more.
And people need to keep in mind too, just back in chapter 8 is the same thing with bitterness. This isn't too far along. The concept of bitterness and guilt and jealousy, it still seems to, there were no numbers separating these words originally.
I'm sorry. Here it is. Verse 14 of chapter 3, the Spirit, and then after he ate this, that it was sweet, he goes, the Spirit lifted me up and took me away, and I went in bitterness in the heat of my spirit, the hand of the Lord being upon me. And then it talks about the siege of Jerusalem in chapter 4 right after that. Where
was this at?
Chapter 3, verse 14. That's the reference to the bitterness. And then in chapter 4 right after that, it's when he talks about the siege of Jerusalem. All right. So again, siege of Jerusalem, it's very similar imagery, similar kind of events. So it makes sense that it has a similar meaning as well.
Yeah.
At least there's precedent for understanding that meaning, So that's kind of how I see that basically. And then he says, you must again prophesy about many peoples, nations, languages, and kings. And then we're going to get into next time, chapter 11, which is the two witnesses. And I'm telling you, it's just going to keep getting better and better. Really cool stuff to talk about. But made it through 3 chapters today, didn't we?
Yeah, and I'm going to add those, when I started uploading these to YouTube, because we haven't necessarily planned this out. I was thinking about that today before I read your email. I was like, I need to start adding these chapters to it. This is turning into a whole series.
Yeah, so people can see which one, and they can check out which one they want.
So I can reference it. Yeah, that's the thing. And I like the way that you, in your novels, I could see. There were some things in Josephus that were just so bad and gory and bizarre, you know, that it was just like, wow, I can't believe this stuff was actually happening there. And I was wondering if you were going to add that crazy guy running around pronouncing woe to Jerusalem. But then I saw that the same way that he was killed in some capacity, you had the two witnesses.
Yeah. We'll talk about that next time. Don't get into that.
So, okay. So I've been wanting to ask you about that.
Yeah.
Like,
there's a whole bunch of stuff to talk about the witnesses and stuff, and I think it'll be really interesting stuff.
Well, it's going to be interesting for me, Brian.
Good foretaste.
Yeah, thank you for coming on tonight, man. We just keep trucking right on through Revelation. You know, for those of you that have been blessed by it, thanks. I just asked that if you've been blessed by Brian's work here, because these shows aren't made because I've done the work. So go check out.
Buy my books.
Buy his books. Try, like, seriously, if you're just interested in what we're talking about and you feel like it's confusing, his novels do a great job of incorporating these themes in a fiction story that's enjoyable. You can even listen to it. You get the audiobook on
I
Audible.
promise you don't have to agree with all the theology or eschatology to enjoy the books, because they're still very historical about Josephus and about the siege of Jerusalem. I tried to be very historical, connected to that. And also I put footnotes in case you're wondering, where did he get that idea from? There's footnotes in the novels, Chronicles of the Apocalypse. They're on audiobook, ebook, or paperback at Amazon exclusively. But I've also got a few theology books that I've written that you can get. One of them is called End Times Bible Prophecy, and that is a really good introduction to preterist thinking. I talk about my own journey, how I became a preterist, and how I was how I was convinced, and I go through Matthew 24 in that book as well. And people have said that it's a great way of introducing that whole topic to them. So check out that book for the theology. And then if you buy the books, I offer some free books in there, free digital books of research and stuff that you can get from me. So yeah, check that stuff out. I think you'll really love it. Also, guys, shameless pitch on my end. Movida Superfoods, which that might be backwards on your screen, but at movidaoils.com, sponsor of Through the Black. Guys, they gave us a lifetime promo code. TTB20. That's all you have to put in the promo code. You will get 20% off any of their CBD products anytime. And anybody that takes CBD regularly, whether it's full spectrum or not, they know how expensive it is. If you get good CBD, it is freaking expensive. This is the only sponsor we've ever let sponsor Through the Black, because so many of you need CBD, and I actually think it's beneficial. It's not just junk. We're not just peddling junk. I use CBD all the time. This lifetime promo code, you can use that code anytime you want. Anytime you use it, you can give it to your friends, your family. You will get 20% off every time. Movida has not done this yet. For some reason, Movida likes Through the Black. He told me he did not care as much about losing some of that money because he likes our tribe. He calls us a tribe. So if you watch Through the Black and you're listening to a couple crazy post-millennials talk about Revelation, you're a part of our tribe and entitled to 20% off. If you need CBD, go buy it at Movida Oil. So anyway, that's it. Buy Brian's books. Go buy Movida CBD products, and we're going to see you next time, guys. We love you.